These are the materials I'll be using in today's lesson. There's a list of these materials in the video description. These are the paint colors I will be using today. You don't need these exact colors, just get somewhere close, and you can find a list of these colors in the video description. Also in the video description is a reference photo as well as a line drawing that you can download for free. Print the line drawing out at the scale you plan on painting it. On the back of your line drawing, I want you to apply graphite or pencil all over the back. Position it on top of your watercolor paper so the graphite is coming in contact, and then tape it in position so it does not shift. Use a ballpoint pen to then trace your entire line drawing, and because of the pressure of your pen, it's going to push that graphite onto your watercolor paper, transferring your entire subject. When you're done, remove your line drawing. As you can see, I have applied some masking fluid. Masking fluid is a liquid that dries to have a plastic finish, and it resists the paint. Masking fluid can then be removed and peeled up later to reveal the original whites of the paper that you've protected. This masking fluid is this particular brand that I like to use. However, I have to protect my paintbrush before I apply it. To do that, I put a small amount of water in a cup, and I use dish soap to make the water full of soap. I then coat my paintbrush using the soapy water, and once my paintbrush is protected, I can then dip into my masking fluid and apply to all the areas where I want to protect. I did this in the white frosting, any areas of bright red that are on my gingerbread man, and I also went ahead and dotted some stars and protected some of the brightest yellow areas where I will be having flames. Once your masking fluid is completely dry, then you will be ready to paint. I'm going to begin by painting everything except the gingerbread man. So to do that, I'm going to get some water on my paint palette. And I want to have water in a few different wells because I have quite a few different colors I plan on mixing. The first color I want to mix is an ultramarine blue. And I have a scrap piece of watercolor paper that I can kind of test out my colors on. Right now, I feel like that's a little too bright. So I'm going to get some Payne's Gray to add it to that ultramarine blue so I can darken it up a bit. Keep in mind your watercolor paints are going to dry to be about 20% lighter than the way they appear when they're wet. So you really have to make sure to mix vibrant colors if you want to give the illusion of an evening or night look. After I've mixed up a nice dark navy blue, I'm also going to mix up just Payne's Gray on its own. I'm also going to be mixing up some brown tones to use for the rocks and the log that the gingerbread man is sitting on. I'm also going to be mixing up some cadmium yellow. Now this yellow is quite bright at the moment. So I'm going to take just the smallest amount of Payne's Gray to make that yellow a little bit more dull. And I don't want the yellow to be too dark, so I'm going to add just a little bit of burnt umber because I need to kind of dull this yellow because right now I feel like it's just a little too vibrant. I feel like that's getting a little closer. Now to begin, I'm going to be applying clean water over everything in my painting, with the exception of the rocks around the fire pit, as well as the gingerbread man himself. Otherwise, everything is going to be getting a layer of clean water. I'm okay with getting water on the log that the gingerbread man is sitting on, but I am being careful to go around the gingerbread man, not getting water inside. I'm making a point to go around the flames to the best of my ability. I don't mind hitting the marshmallow. There are some areas of my paper where I had started applying the water, but since it's been a while, they're already beginning to dry. So I'd like to keep an eye on those areas, and I just resaturate some of the water. I'm going to apply water right over top of the stick. So I'm currently going around and resaturating the water if areas are beginning to dry. It'll be pretty obvious because the gloss will begin disappearing. But before I begin adding color, I need to take a moment to soak up any of the thick standing puddles of water. If I leave those puddles, it's going to make it very challenging for me to actually paint. So I dry my brush off on my sponge, and once my brush is dry, I can then go into some of these thicker puddles, and my dry brush will just soak up that excess water, evening out everything. And that's exactly what I want. Because of this additional water on the paper, it will dilute our colors a little bit. So really make sure you have vibrant colors before you go in to paint. I'm now going to grab that ultramarine blue with Payne's Gray. And I'm going to go all the way across the sky and trees in the background. And I can already tell that I'm going to want this color to be darker still. So I'm going to get more pigment, add it to my mixture so I can darken it up. So I'm adding that ultramarine blue, and I am getting additional Payne's Gray to really push that color darker, because my paints are going to dry to be about 20% lighter than what they appear when they're wet. So I need to kind of mix them and make sure they appear just a tad too dark when I apply them wet so that they actually dry to the right color. I'm really trying to take my time around the outer edge of the gingerbread man. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Once I get about halfway down on my background, I'm going to be switching to more of just a straight ultramarine color. So I'm going to rinse my brush. I'm going to be heavier on the ultramarine than I am on the Payne's Gray. I want to test out the value of my color before I go into my painting, and that looks about right. And I want to get this ultramarine blue down and around, but I have to be aware of some of the yellows that I want to be present as a glow from the fire pit. I can go right over top of this log. It's going to be so dark that I need to have blues in my brown mixture anyways, for the shadows. Notice how I'm not bringing the paint right up against the rocks of the campfire. I'm taking my time going around some of the flames. If you have a good point on your round brush, you should be able to get into some of those narrow spaces fairly easy. I'm going to be switching to a smaller paintbrush, a number 2 round, just to help me get into some of these tight spaces. I want there to be some dark colors in the shadow area between the legs. Some areas of my paper are already beginning to dry, so I need to kind of pick up the pace. I'm just applying a little bit of water in these areas so I can saturate it a little bit more. Because this paper is already beginning to dry in this lower area, the water I'm applying is going to be creating blooms and texture, but those blooms are going to actually help me out here because I need help pushing some of these blues out and away from the fire pit. So by intentionally creating blooms, by bringing in excess water to these areas that are already beginning to dry, it's going to help make room for some of the other colors I would like to establish in these areas. So I am embracing the blooms. I'm going to be switching to my number 6 round. Not quite as small, but not quite as large as the other brushes I've been using. Now that everything is a little more resaturated, I can grab that cadmium yellow that I added the burnt umber to. And I can just tap in some yellows so it looks like there's a glow from the campfire. I'm trying to clean up some of the edges that are up against my gingerbread man, just so I have a nice, neat product in the end. Now I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer to make sure everything is completely dry. And then I can do the next layer. Notice how I did not go back into the upper half of my background because I know that area is already beginning to dry. So I want to kind of give that space. Any additional details regarding trees can be done on the second layer. Now that everything is completely dry, I can take a moment to look at the outer edges and see if there's anything that needs to be cleaned up. At this moment, I'm probably going to lighten some of the colors in the marshmallow, and I'm going to clean up the edge on the right side of the head of the gingerbread man. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to find a square brush that has relatively stiff bristles, and that's going to make things easier. I'm going to dip my square brush into a cup of clean water, and I want to run my fingers across the top edge of the paintbrush just to remove any droplets of water that might be hanging out on this metal area of my brush. Now I'm not going to dry it. Instead, I'm going to get a clean paper towel. And when I get to the edge that I want cleaned up, I'm just going to use the corner of my brush and do a little bit of scrubbing. It doesn't take much pressure. When you see the paint starting to lift and erase from the surface of the paper, you can press down with your paper towel to pick up the color that you just erased. Now, Payne's Gray and Ultramarine Blue are two staining pigments, so they're going to be a little tougher to erase, and they're going to leave a small tint behind. But as you can see, it's not bad at all. The other area that I'm going to lift is within this marshmallow. So the color I just erased is currently on my brush, making it messy. So I'm going to re-rinse my brush, and I'm going to squeegee off the droplets of water using my fingers. And now I can go into this marshmallow using my square brush and just lifting some of this color here so it's not quite as dark. I want there to be good visibility of this marshmallow. I also am going to use this square brush to lift a little bit of the color from the stick. And I want you to notice how little the bristles on the brush are moving. They're not bending a great deal. Most of the lifting is simply coming from water being on my brush. It's not about muscle. I think those are the only areas that I personally want to clean up. And I can now return to painting some of the background elements. So I would like to have the silhouette of some trees in the background. To do that, I'm going to use that darker Payne's Gray mixture. And I'm going to come behind my gingerbread man, and I'm going to try to go in between and around the stars that I had applied masking fluid to. Now, a lot of times people make the mistake of making their trees too perfect. Thinking of that traditional, perfect evergreen Christmas tree that I think is stuck in everybody's head. So I want you to, be allowed to have fun, interesting shapes that are unique and not symmetrical. And that's going to help your evergreen trees look a little bit more natural. I also want to have my trees at different heights. So I just draw a trunk of the location of where I want my tree. And I'm going to paint a few trees going all the way across. So I'm going to find the next location where I want a tree. Make sure it's in between some of the masking fluid I have there for stars. If I get close to the flames, I'm just slowing down my pace so I can make sure to avoid adding paint to them. My trees are going to get shorter and shorter as they get closer to my gingerbread man. I'm really slowing down to make sure I don't hit his head. And I'm really just doing some scribbling with my brush, dabbing and dotting. Once I'm happy with those tree silhouettes, I'm going to add some glazes of color to give more definitions to the snow. To do that, I want to mix up a very watered down ultramarine blue. I want to just create a glaze. So I do not want this color too dark, and I think that is even too dark. So I'm going to add more water. I'm just using my paintbrush to transfer water from my water cup, and I feel like that's more the value that I need at this moment. So I want to come in with this glaze and just in a few areas, I just want to add a hint of some ground texture to the snow. The stones that are around the campfire are creating a shadow. So I do want to have some of this glaze right up against these rocks. The legs of the gingerbread man should be creating some shadows as well. So I'm adding some glazes of blue near the bottom of the legs. Now I'm going to get a darker mixture of this ultramarine blue. So I'm just adding more pigment in with my glaze mixture. And in the very bottom, I'm just going to push the values here to be a little bit darker. I can also layer some of this darker ultramarine blue on some parts of the glaze near the rocks, as well as near the feet. I can also kind of add some of this darker ultramarine blue just behind the fire pit, so I can kind of control how far up that glow from the flames is going. I don't want it to be too tall or it's going to make the perspective look strange. I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side, kind of follow the same height of where I put the ultramarine blue on the opposite. Back by the trees, I can add a glaze of this ultramarine blue, so it just kind of gives the appearance of a snowbank. So that grounds the trees a little bit so they don't look like they're floating. I really slow down when I get close to my subject. Now I'm going to hit this with a blow dryer so I can begin adding details to other elements of my painting. The next part I'm going to work on are the flames of the campfire. But in order to do that, I need to mix up a few different colors. One of which is just going to be the cadmium yellow on its own. The next color I'm going to mix up is more of a cadmium orange. And then lastly, I'm going to mix up a little bit of that cadmium red, but I'm going to be adding some orange to it so it's not so strong. So it's more of a red orange. And then lastly, I want some of the flames to look pretty dark as they are kind of translucent and we are up against a dark background. So I'm going to take some of that cadmium red and orange, and I'm going to add some ultramarine blue to them. It should create kind of this dark, warm brown. So to begin, I'm going to apply just a little bit of clean water to the flames. I'm going to do my best to not come in contact with the background. If I do, I simply grab a section of dry paper towel and soak up the water that got into my background. Sometimes it's helpful to load your brush with less water so it's easier to control where it goes. You can also just avoid going right up against your outer edge. Give yourself a little bit of space, and that's going to make things easier. If it ends up touching some of the logs, I wouldn't even worry about it. In fact, I'm going to actually just apply this water right over top of the logs. Even if it hits some of the rocks, that's okay, because there will be some reflected color of the flames that should be visible on your rocks. So if you get water on your rocks, it's no big deal. I'm going right over top of that masking fluid, not worried about it at all. Now I'm going to start with that orange-red mixture. That's going to be on the most outer edges of our fire flames. And I'm going to switch to a small brush to give myself better visibility. We will also want to avoid puddling of paint, because if we overload our brush too much with our paint color, it's going to be very hard to keep control of, and it's going to just want to dominate the entire area where the fire is. So load your brush less. You can even tap the top surface of a sponge or paper towel to make sure you don't have too much paint in your brush. And I want you to just focus on the outer edges of your flame with this orange-red. Using a small brush is going to help ensure you don't introduce too much of this color, and that it only travels a short distance. I accidentally get some of this color on the background, I don't really mind it because it just looks like some of the flames are translucent and it creates more of a glow. Once you have the outer edges with that red-orange, I want you to rinse your brush, grab some just cadmium orange, and go just inside these outer edges with that cadmium orange. I also want this cadmium orange to go down and around the bottom area of your fire pit. As we work our way towards the center, rinse your brush, grab some of that cadmium yellow, make sure it's nice and vibrant, and just go right over any masking fluid you have to fill in everything. And this is just layer 1. I'm going to also be using some of this cadmium yellow on the bottom edge of my marshmallow. So it looks like we're getting some of that reflected color of the fire on the white marshmallow. I'm also going to be painting the area of the stick yellow for now. While those areas are drying, I'm going to switch back to my number 6 round, and I'm going to apply clean water to my gingerbread man. I'm going to wait a little bit before I wet the arm where the stick is. So for now, I'm just going to apply clean water everywhere else except that arm. Right now, that yellow I just applied is probably needing some time to dry. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Now in the front of my gingerbread man, I want some reflected color coming from the fire pit. So I'm applying some of that cadmium yellow to the front face, in front of the belly. So it looks like there's a bit of a glow on him. Now I'm going to be mixing this color right on my paper. So I'm now going to grab a little bit of that burnt umber. To add some shadows. And I'm not trying to be perfect just yet. I just want to get some color down on him while he's wet. And then I can be particular about my edges. I'm going to mix up some burnt sienna, which is more of this rusty orange brown. I'm just tapping my brush to get some of this color down in the areas where we have shadows. I'm going to be removing any puddling of paint using a dry brush to give myself more control. I can also use this burnt sienna and I can kind of blend a small amount of it onto the front face of my gingerbread man in the area where it looks like he's glowing. I'm just pulling the tiniest bit of this color into the yellow that I applied there. I'm now going to switch to my small brush for better visibility. And I'm now just going to take a moment to be particular about the paint going right up against the edges. Before this dries, I'm going to get some of that burnt sienna. I'm going to add some of that burnt umber to it, so it's kind of this medium brown tone between the two colors. And I'm just going to work on perfecting some of the shapes of my shadows. Keeping in mind that the color will dry 20% lighter, so really make sure you get enough pigment and minimal water in your mixture so you can get that contrast between the front of your gingerbread man and the shadows. There should be a shadow down and around the bow tie. Should be a shadow underneath the arm. In the right half of each leg. Down and around those little buttons on his tummy. and along the right half of that back arm. I'm just taking a moment to make sure I have the color where I want it. If any of these dark shadow colors are creeping in to the lighter areas of your gingerbread man, you can rinse and dry your brush, and you can use your dry brush to kind of soak up some of the paint from the areas where you want that highlight. You can control how far your shadow color travels by using a dry brush and firm pressure. This is just layer one, so I'm going to let that gingerbread dry for now. And I'm going to go to the rocks around my campfire. I want these rocks to be on the darker side. I'm going to use the same color I mixed up, which is the burnt umber and burnt sienna for the shadows of my gingerbread man. And I'm painting wet on dry. And I'm just going to start at a back rock and continue moving through each rock. I'm not going to bother with any shadows or texture at the moment. I just want to kind of get a base color in. I'm also going to put some of this color on the logs, but I want to water it down a bit so it's not as dark. I'm just doing a glaze of this watered down color where we have the logs. I'm going to also do just a little bit of glazing in between these logs here. I'm going to use a rubber cement pickup. I'm not removing all masking fluid just yet, only off the marshmallow. I'm using firm pressure get the masking fluid off the marshmallow. I'm going to push that masking fluid that peeled up away. And I want to add some color to the flames on the marshmallow. So I'm going to use some of that cadmium orange. As we get down into the marshmallow, I'm going to switch to a burnt umber. You just want to give the illusion that the marshmallow is burning. So I'm giving it kind of a irregular edge. And while this is still wet, I can take some of that darker Payne's gray and I can just tap my brush in here to create some texture. And I need to give that some space to dry. I'm now going to work on the little arm we skipped on our gingerbread man. I'm just going to apply a little bit of water. I don't want puddles. That's going to make it hard for things to be controlled. I'm going to do my best to go around the stick, but if I need some gouache later to kind of clean up some of my edges, I can. We want to remember that there is a glow coming from the campfire, so we want to add some yellow to this hand and arm. And now I'm going to use that burnt sienna mixture. Trying my best to go around that roasting stick. And I can rinse and dry my brush off. And using my dry brush, I can kind of blend these colors and soak up any puddling that is happening. Now I'm going to add a little bit of texture to our gingerbread man so he reads like a cookie. I want to water down my burnt sienna and cadmium yellow mixture. So I can just create a glaze. I'm going to show you how light this is. I'm going to test my values. So that's as dark as I want it. And we're going to create glazes on the cookie to give him some texture. I'm now going to dip my brush in this glaze color, and I tapped my sponge before coming to the cookie. I may even add just a little bit more water. But I just want to create some texture on him. So I'm kind of dabbing my brush. I'm going to add this texture all over. While this texture is drying, I'm going to return to my rocks and give them some details. I want to add some Payne's Gray to my burnt umber, so it is a darker color. And I don't want to smooth out all the roughness. So I'm going to be deliberately creating some harsh shadows that are on the opposite side of these stones from the fire. And it's easy to paint one stone, one size in shape, and then just repeat that shape over and over. So try to just add some variety to your shadows so they look like individual unique rocks. Make sure your eyes are still looking at that reference photo to guide you. So you have an idea of where to put some of your shadows. I'm going to get some burnt umber that does not have the Payne's Gray. And I'm going to start adding some shadows to some of the logs. Even the logs, though, have a rough texture to them. So leaving parts of the log rough where you can see the brush strokes, that's okay. Gonna make it look like bark. While those areas are drying, I'm going to return to my gingerbread man and give a little bit more definition and bump up the contrast on some of these shadows. So I'm going to use my burnt umber. I want to just create a glaze so it's not super dark. And I'm going to come into some of these areas where I have strong definition of where the shadow is. I'm also going to do a glaze underneath the bow tie, so it looks like a shadow, as well as around the buttons. I'm just staying to one side though, trying to be aware of the direction of my light source. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I accidentally went over my stick, but I can just lift that later. I'm going to use this ultramarine, or not the ultramarine, let's go with the burnt umber to create these eyebrows. I'm going to get some of my dark Payne's Gray to paint the eyes. And I'm going to add some of this Payne's Gray to the mouth as well. I'm going to use this Payne's Gray to give more definition between the head and shoulder. And this is just a really watered down Payne's Gray. I'm being very selective with where I apply this color. I want it to be very minimal. I'm going to return to the Campfire, and with some of my burnt umber, just want to darken up some sections of these logs. I can add some texture using the burnt umber to the rocks or stones. Now I've rinsed my brush, and with this damp brush, I can lift out just a couple highlights on these stones. So it's just going to add a third value. I'm now going to get the darker burnt umber that I added the Payne's Gray to. And I need to paint the little log that our gingerbread man is sitting on. This log should be visible between the legs of our gingerbread man. I'm going to use this same dark brown for the opposite side of the roasting stick. I'm going to do another layer of Payne's Gray on the eyes and mouth. First layer just didn't get as dark as I would like. With a more watered down version of the Payne's Gray, I can add some texture to the end of this log. You can also darken up some of the color that is nearest to our gingerbread man, as he would be creating a shadow. If you need contrast between the logs and some of your stones, you can go through and do a second layer of lifting with a damp brush just to lift out some additional highlights. You can also come in with some of the Payne's Gray and glaze part of the log that is closest to some of those stones to make them pop out a little bit more. right below the stones on the snow, we do want a real strong shadow color. So I'm grabbing more of that ultramarine blue that has the added Payne's gray. And I'm just coming in here to really push those shadows to be darker. I can do the same thing with the shadows that are near my gingerbread man. Some of them should be quite a bit darker, especially behind the legs. There should be a little bit of a shadow near the log. So I'm using that ultramarine blue. Just pushing some of the shadows in my nearby snow. Now I need to let this all dry, so I'm going to work a little bit more on the marshmallow. I'm going to get some of that red orange and on just a few select ends of the flame. If there's any puddling, I just soak that up using a dry brush. You can continue to add some more texture to this burnt marshmallow. I'm now going to water down some of that red orange and create a glaze. And in just a few areas in between some of the flames, I'm just going to do a glaze of this orange red. To add some texture to it. You can add some of this cadmium red with orange to the flames right between the logs at the bottom. Just try to keep one area as more of a yellow glow near the center. With this burnt umber, I'm going to add a little shadow behind the frosting on the head, so just above. Trying to do that on any of the frosting. The section of trying to determine which section of the frosting would be creating a shadow. I'm going to lift that small section of shadow color that overlapped my roasting stick. Adding a little bit more orange to the flames. Now I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer so I can lift some of the masking fluid. Right now the log that my gingerbread man is sitting on needs a little bit of a highlight. So I'm just lifting a little with a damp brush. Once you've lifted it, you can actually go in with a yellow just to brighten up that edge. All right, go ahead and dry it, and then we will remove all masking fluid. To remove the masking fluid, you can use your fingers or a rubber cement pickup. Make sure to remove all the little stars. I'm going to get some cadmium yellow on my brush. And I'm going to paint this inside portion of the flames with my cadmium yellow. I'm going to let that cadmium yellow have a chance to dry. I'm going to add some watered down cadmium red to the nose so it looks like a soft pink. I'm going to mix a more vibrant cadmium red. And I'm going to get some color on this bow tie. Just painting wet on dry. I really try to make sure my brush isn't too loaded with paint so I can get into these small spaces. I'm going to get some watered down ultramarine blue. I want a really, really light glaze. I'm going to show you how light. That's probably a little too dark. I'm going to lighten it up even more with some additional water. And that's more what I'm looking for. And I just want to add a glaze of this light blue to parts of the white so it looks like there's a shadow. Especially to the frosting that is going to be in shadow. I'm going to add a little bit more contrast to some of these logs that are camouflaged into the stones a little too much. So I'm just going in with a more opaque Payne's gray, trying to darken the logs that are behind the stones so those stones pop forward a little more. I can do the same thing at the bottom of the stones where they meet the snow. I can just add some of this more opaque Payne's gray on the opposite side of the rock. And that's just going to help our contrast. I'm going to mix a little bit of the ultramarine blue with my cadmium red so it makes more of a burgundy. And with this color, I'm just going to add some shadows to the bow tie. And that is not dark enough, so I'm going to get some more pigment. So we want 75% red and 25% of that ultramarine blue. And that's going to give us a really nice burgundy color. I'm going to take some of that burnt umber and just darken up some parts of the burnt section of the marshmallow. And that's about it for this painting. So if you are enjoying seeing how I go about these paintings, please hit that subscribe button, give it a thumbs up. And if there's a suggestion on what subject I should paint next, please do leave a comment. I want to help you guys. Have a fantastic holiday and enjoy the rest of your day.